Okay, we have 162 people as our participants this morning. Thank you all so very much for joining us. And welcome to New York Climate Week and our webinar on combating climate disinformation on social media. It's just wonderful to see so many people with us. I am Kate Sell. I am the Senior Climate Campaign Manager with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm expecting that many of us are probably all too familiar with Zoom at this point. We'll be taking questions in the Q&A, which you access by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, next door to the chat function. You can add questions during the presentations whenever they occur to you. The panelists will be giving their presentations first, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. I should explain that we are not in Zoom conference mode or meeting mode. This is Zoom webinar mode, where not everyone's we only see the participants. We don't see all of the, we only see the panelists. We don't see all of the participants. So this is different from our regular day-to-day Zoom meetings. This is a Zoom webinar, and that's why we can't see all of you as much as we would like to. Again, please use the Q&A function to add your questions at any point during the presentations. The panelists will give their presentations first, and then we'll take questions at the end. This webinar is a joint production of the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Citizens Platform on Climate Change, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, and Upshift Strategies. This webinar is being recorded for the many people who wanted to attend, but not at 6 o'clock in the morning. And now it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Astrid, Senior Climate Scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists, who will be our moderator today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Hello, everyone. As Kate said, I'm a Senior Climate Scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I would like to reinforce the issue that if you put a question in the chat, your question may get lost. So if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function. And I'm going to be introducing the panelists, and then the panelists are going to speak in the order that I am introduced. Yeah, so here we go. Our first speaker is Lindsay Berger. She is the Strategic Partnerships and Campaign Manager in the Union of Concerned Scientists Center for Science and Democracy, where a majority of her time is dedicated to helping the science community understand and combat disinformation. Thank you, Lindsay. We need you. Lindsay is a co-founder, advisory committee member, and former executive director of Uncock My Campus, a national organization working to protect academia from undue political and ideological influences of folks like the billionaire industrialist Charles Khoo and others in his dark money network. Lindsay has more than a decade of experience supporting organizing and research-based campaigns, working to protect communities from bad actors polluting our environment, schools, and our democracy. Before her time with UCS and Uncock My Campus, Lindsay worked for the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Oil Change International, Documented, and the Sunrise Project. Welcome, Lindsay. Next, we're going to have Michael Khoo. He's the co-chair of the Climate Disinformation Coalition and has 30+ years experience developing communications campaigns on progressive issues. He built the coalition in 2018 with Friends of the Earth, where he consults for their communications and climate change departments. Khoo has focused on a diversity of issues, including climate change, tech platform disinformation, LGBTQ and trans health rights, plastics pollution and petrochemicals, and fossil fuel financial regulation. He is co-founder of Upshift Strategies, a Washington, D.C.-based communications and strategy firm. Previously, Khoo was executive vice president at Spitfire Strategies, where he coordinated the 2014-2015 National Net Neutrality Campaign, a large-scale coalition campaign that overcame the entrenched Washington telecommunications industry. Michael was vice president for communications at the Reproductive Health Rights Group, PAI, from 2009 to 2012, and served as the organization's interim co-director in 2010. Previous to that, he was the Washington representative for the Union of Concerned Scientists, lead campaigner for Greenpeace Canada, and worked on environmental issues with the David Suzuki Foundation and the Toronto Environmental Alliance. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Bhanu Neupane. Bhanu is trained in hydrosystems, water resources management, and knowledge management. He has a PhD in water resources management from Canada and a second doctoral degree in business administration from the International School of Management, France and USA. He started his career as a change agent for a GTZ-funded agricultural inputs project in eastern Nepal in 1987. He also served as an agriculture and natural resource management specialist for a governmental research organization in Nepal. During 1997-99, he worked as a consultant in the US and served in several Southeast Asian countries. He joined UNESCO as a program specialist in 2001. Currently, he is working for UNESCO as an advisor for ICT and sciences and open access to scientific research. He is also working in the area of open data and artificial intelligence, essentially to improve and increase access to scientific data and information. He regularly teaches courses related to knowledge management, climate change, disinformation, multi-criteria decision-making, water resources management, and disaster risk reduction. And if you don't know any of the any acronyms that I used in his introduction, please post on the chat. We'll try to give you the meaning of those acronyms. Last but not least, we have Ricardo Gracie. He is the co-founder of Citizens Platform on Climate Change and a Sustainable World, an independent information and communication world initiative. Writer, journalist, activist, media, and civil society development manager, Ricardo was born in Argentina, is based in Italy, and started his environmental and sustainable development engagement on the occasion of the United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, my hometown, in 1992. Ricardo is former editor-in-chief of the international news agency IPS Interpress Service, follows its school of thought with regard to accuracy, sources of information, and dissemination. He likes the truth, basically. So these are our panelists. If you need any clarifying things not related to what they're going to be talking about, you can post on the chat. We'll try to follow up with that. If you have a question specific to their points during their presentations, please use the Q&A. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Lindsay. Lindsay, please go ahead. Welcome.
Wonderful. Hi, folks. Team, can you all hear me okay? Great. Before we get started, I just want to thank all of you for your interest in this issue and for joining us today. Nearly 1,200 folks registered for this webinar, which is absolutely incredible and demonstrates just how many of you are fired up about combating disinformation. So thank you for being here, for those of you who are awake, who are here, and for those of you who will listen to this and watch this later. To get started, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page about what we mean when we say misinformation and disinformation. Sorry. Okay. Next slide. Misinformation is false information that is spread regardless of whether there is intent to mislead. Whereas a lot of misinformation is intentional, in many instances, it may be accidental because the person or channel relaying the information may actually believe it to be true. Thank you, Astrid. I pulled this from that lovely blog that you wrote. Um, comparatively, next slide, disinformation is deliberate. It's a form of propaganda involving the dissemination of false information with the deliberate intent to deceive or mislead. I'll say it again, disinformation is deliberate. While I increasingly think that it will be essential for all of us to get formally trained on when to address and how to prevent misinformation, especially for those of you in the science community, which I believe that many of you are, we must also not forget about the folks who are funding and fueling disinformation, as there is far too little attention in the media and public understanding of these bad actors. Much of the disinformation we see, especially around issues concerning climate, democracy, workers' rights and safety, et cetera, stem from the same folks. They are highly organized, connected, and integrated. And this network has been in the making since 1971. Next slide. Much of this coordination began with the Powell Memo. This August marked the 50th anniversary of this memo that future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell wrote to the Chamber of Commerce. It is seen as a blue.
I'm really sorry to interrupt
Sure.
you, but people are having a hard time seeing the whole of your slides. There we go.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you all for bearing with us. Okay, let's see. All right, so I was saying much of this coordination began with the Powell Memo. This August marked the 50th anniversary of this memo that the future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell wrote to the Chamber of Commerce. It is seen as a blueprint for corporate survival in the face of civil rights, labor, and environmental gains made in the 60s, including clear instructions for the corporate subversion of government, courts, media, and academia. Most of these tactics we've seen on display in these 4 areas are exactly what these players have been implementing for the last 5 decades. And this is one of the most influential documents in history, and yet hardly anyone knows about it, which is indicative of the lack of attention and understanding the press and public have surrounding just how coordinated and deliberate this effort is. Next slide. In the years following Powell's memo, much of the critical infrastructure to advance their free market, anti-government, anti-regulatory agenda took shape, including but not limited to the American Legislative Exchange Council, the State Policy Network, the Americans for Prosperity, and the Council of National Policy. There are a handful of funders behind most of the national efforts, like Charles Koch, Mercer, Scaife, the Bradleys, the Coors, but also reputable and influential players similar at the state level, like Art Pope in North Carolina and Rex Sinkfield in Missouri. While most of whom have shared interests and agendas like those shown on the slide, some of these funders hone in on specific strategies of interest to them, like the DeVos family on privatizing education. And the Mercers are mega funders of the media strategy as laid out by Powell in his memo. And given the short time we have today together, and because they're perhaps the most expansive and influential, I want to look at the Koch network. Next slide. Charles Koch. He is a billionaire businessman from Kansas who owns Koch Industries, one of the largest privately owned businesses in the US. It owns a diverse group of companies involved in refining chemicals, process and pollution control equipment and technologies, minerals, fertilizers, polymers and fibers, commodity trading and services, forest and consumer products, and ranching. The New Yorker has described David Koch, well, David Koch has passed, and his brother Charles Koch as longtime libertarians who believe in drastically lower personal and corporate taxes, minimal social services for the needy, and much less oversight of the industry, especially environmental regulation. Charles Koch surrounded himself, has and continues to surround himself with like minds like Richard Fink, the former tobacco lobbyist who developed a system for influencing cultural and policy change to advance their ideological and political agenda, called the structure of social change, which I'll get into in a second. To help implement this strategy, Koch created and built up a network, or a constellation of groups funded by the billionaire industrialist and around 700 like-minded conservatives and libertarians that contribute at least $100,000 annually to be a part of it, to advance this agenda. The network, the Koch network, is formally known as the Seminar Network, but it was recently rebranded as Stand Together. Next slide. All right, structure of social change. Step one, fund scholarly activity at universities in order to create, quote unquote, intellectual raw materials. In other words, find free market loving scholars to pay to churn out research that advances their ideological and political agenda. In my time with Uncoke My Campus, we noticed a fair deal of academic research attacking environmental efforts, from even touting the health benefits of smog to financial benefits from privatizing public lands. An example of this is some documents in 2013 revealed that the Koch-funded Beacon Hill Institute, which is housed at Suffolk University in Boston, promised its corporate donors research that would pave the way for, quote unquote, legislative activity that will pare back or repeal the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. At Utah State University and its affiliated Koch-funded Strata Policy Center appear to be the leading producers of research attacking public lands and monument designations. And the list goes on. There's so much of this research. This academic research is then passed along to Koch-funded think tanks with the seeming stamp of approval and sheen of legitimacy from the academic institution where a Koch-funded academic conducted that research. And it's important to keep in mind that we know that Charles Koch only funds programs that, and this is a quote from him, contribute in some way to our individual companies or the general welfare of our free enterprise system. He stated this in 1974 in a memo to corporate leaders, building off of Powell's memo from 1971. Next slide. Step two of the structure of social change: fund think tanks to convert abstract academic work into digestible forms, i.e. reports, policy briefs, lobbying materials, etc. And most of these think tanks are members of the State Policy Network, or SPN, which is collectively devoted to discovering and developing market-oriented solutions to state and local policy issues. SPN and the Heritage Foundation are the primary authors of the model voter suppression bills that we're seeing spill into states across the country, and their respective sister organizations, American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, as you may have heard it be referred to, and Heritage Action, which both advocate to get the bill enacted. So one way to think about SPN, or the State Policy Network, is as the policy, communications, and litigations arm of ALEC, which we'll get to more in a second, giving the cookie cutter ALEC agenda a sheen of academic legitimacy to support academic legitimacy and state-based support. Many SPN groups are and often write ALEC model bills. Next slide. Step three, fund citizen implementation groups and politicians in order to push these policy reports into law. Groups like Americans for Prosperity, the Libre Initiative, which is focused on Latinx community engagement, and Generation Opportunity, which is focused on younger generations, are among them. Researchers at Harvard and Columbia universities found back in 2018 that Americans for Prosperity alone rivaled the Republican Party here in the States in terms of size, staffing, and organizational capacity. It pulled the Republican Party to the far right on economic, tax, and regulatory issues. It was crucial to the success of the Tea Party movement, the ousting of Democrats from Congress, and staffing of Trump's transition team. I pulled that quote from an article in The Guardian. And now it's important that I unpack ALEC and the Heritage Action a little bit further. Next slide. ALEC is a corporate bill mill. Through ALEC, corporations hand state legislators their wish list to benefit their bottom line. Corporations fund almost all of ALEC's operations. They pay for a seat on ALEC task forces where corporate lobbyists and special interest representatives vote with ALEC member elected officials to approve model bills. These elected officials are spoon-fed policies that support these corporations' bottom lines. The corporations are leading the conversations around strategy, not legislators. And the average person doesn't have this kind of access to elected officials, right? Like these corporations do, who are part of ALEC, nor do they have influence over them like these corporations who have been slipping them money for years. So I've just dropped a lot on you. So we're gonna just like take a moment, take like a collective deep breath of outrage of how coordinated this deception is. And further, I would like to introduce you to Jessica Anderson, the Executive Director of Heritage Action. Next slide.
Iowa was the first state that we...
Oh. Bear with us for just a second.
I'm Ari Berman, voting rights reporter for Mother Jones, with an exclusive new video from...
Thank you.
I'm Ari Berman, voting rights reporter for Mother Jones, with an exclusive new video from Documented about a right-wing group leading...
Sorry, it should start at minute, it should say 1:05 is the start time, I believe, or maybe it's already set to that. It starts with, no, sorry, yeah, it goes back to the beginning. Yeah, there we go.
Iowa was the first state that we got to work in, and we did it quickly and we did it quietly. Honestly, nobody noticed. At the end of the day, the bill that Governor Kemp signed and the Georgia legislature marshaled through had 8 key provisions that Heritage recommended.
This leaked video reveals how Heritage is leading a massive right-wing campaign to suppress voting rights in key battleground states like Georgia, Arizona, Florida, and Iowa just this year.
We're working with these state legislators to make sure they have all of the information they need to draft the bills. In some cases, we actually draft them for them, or we have a sentinel on our behalf give them the model legislation. So it has that grassroots, from the bottom up type of vibe.
While these bills are being sold as protecting quote unquote election integrity, the real purpose seems to be to help Republicans win elections. They plan to spend $24 million over the next 2 years in Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, Texas,
Pennsylvania,
and beyond to quote unquote right the wrongs of November.
And we are going to take the fierce fire that is in every single one of our bellies to right the wrongs of November, to right the wrongs of the mistreatment against these men, and move it into other states.
The Heritage Foundation is one of the best funded think tanks in Republican circles. They write the policy, and their sister organization, the dark money group Heritage Action, makes it happen. From writing and advocating these anti-democratic bills to leading the effort to block the For the People Act in Congress, Heritage is weaponizing Trump's big lie to motivate their donors and their base to strip Americans of their fundamental right to vote.
All right, so I'm just further trying to outrage you and help you understand this network. You may be, well, actually, I want to just first lift up something in the chat. We have Representative David Michael here from Connecticut, and they noted that we have seen some ALEC and ALEC type bills every year in the state of Connecticut. And so just further reinforce, this is something that folks are seeing everywhere. Thank you for sharing that, Representative. Now, y'all may be wondering why I'm raising this example about voting rights in a conversation that you joined that is about climate disinformation and social media. There are 2 reasons for this. One is this network's infrastructure is versatile. It can and has been used to advance their free market, anti-government, and anti-regulatory agenda, and shows up in the form of attacks on climate progress, on fair wages, public education, and more. The second reason, sorry, my earbud fell out of my ear, is that voting is power. It's a right that enables us to select candidates who we think best align with our values and advance the issues we care about, whether that's climate change, reproductive rights, fair wages, or something else. And without this right, we lose some of our power. And that is precisely the reason why these groups like Heritage and ALEC and those funding and fueling them are investing so heavily in gerrymandering and passing voter restriction laws, as seen in this next quote. Next slide. This is from founder of Heritage Foundation and early leader of ALEC. I don't want everyone to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of the people. As a matter of fact, our leverage in elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. Many Republicans claim that their motivation is grounded in concerns over voter fraud. However, this quote better represents the truth, as the voting restrictions many Republicans are pushing will disproportionately make it harder for Black, Brown, and young voters to participate in the electoral process. I also should note, I just want to acknowledge that I know there are other folks on this call who are not based in the States or from the States. I want to share that this network's influence is not limited to the US. It operates through an organization or network called the Atlas Network, an international umbrella organization of over 450 affiliates in 96 countries. Recently, British journalists have discovered that the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is the leading UK-based Atlas affiliate, played a secretive role in Brexit that has since landed it in legal trouble. So too have Coke industry representatives hosted visitors from Australia who sought their investment to, quote unquote, change the voting system down under. So this is not just about the US. This is not limited to here. I want to close by reminding you that there is power in having information, in having this information. There is power in our outrage if we choose to channel it into taking action for public good. So I hope you bring that mentality forward as we continue. And I'm going to close there. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lindsay. Let's get that fire up. Next, to continue, with the fire, let's hear from Michael. Mic is yours, Michael.
Wonderful, thanks. Excited to talk with such a big group and honored to be on with such a brilliant panelists. If you can, Allison, put up the first slide. It's really helpful to be doing this talk right after Lindsay's presentation because she's been discussing the structural problem. And I think many tech platforms try to make the problem of disinformation or climate disinformation a problem of individual users. They put the onus on them to solve it or to self-protect themselves. This is the equivalent of people thinking that recycling a single-use plastic bottle will save the planet. This is the industry outsourcing the problem they created onto individuals. The problem was created by companies and coordinated actors over decades, and it's not going to go away just because individuals feel they have to solve it themselves. In fact, that's the tool of disempowerment that has been used on any of our issues, from pesticides to transportation policy to climate change, and now technology. And there are major policy decisions that we'll talk about that we can easily see make sense, but it's a big picture issue that the environmental movement has faced, women's movement has faced many issues. So I'm going to start by talking about the growing problem of climate change disinformation, trends that we've seen in the research, and then what we could be done to solve and rein in this problem. Next slide, please. Starting with the fundamentals, a couple of years ago, Friends of the Earth started looking at the broader ecosystem of how we use communications to fight for the environment, and how that was being undermined on a deep level. We saw how the tools and the mechanisms that we were using were quickly slipping out of our control. And if you remember, we look back to the period of the growth of the internet itself from the 90s to the early 2000s. And this is a time when the internet was, relatively speaking, open and decentralized. decentralized. It was more public than it was private. And while the progressive movement had an early edge, particularly in mastering things like email technology and analytics and social media content creation, that edge rapidly faded. Over the 2000s, the public spaces began being controlled by fewer and fewer corporations. Open technologies got replaced with closed technologies. In many areas, people's multiple choices of internet providers themselves was whittled down to one or two. And the platforms have become concentrated. And that means for those of us who fight for the environment, that the polluting companies we oppose are gaining the upper hand. Next slide, please. One challenge for all of us here, listeners on the call, all of us fighting this, is that disinformation is everywhere and it feels overwhelming. Every new week, there's a news story of some new horror that Facebook has undertaken, either ignoring the recommendations to reduce hate speech or reduce sexual harassment or prevent an insurrection of the government itself. And study after study confirms that the fossil fuel industry and its web of influencers, both paid and organic, is hard at work spreading disinformation on climate change. And Facebook, and Twitter, Google, day by day are making it harder to see what happens on the platform while giving a free pass to the top climate deniers. Next slide, please. So you think, why does this happen? And on a fundamental level, we've had climate disinformation for decades, but it was seeming to decline through the 2000s, where major news outlets were no longer printing straight up climate denialism. And the scientific consensus became much more widely accepted across the globe and across America, but not on social media. Social media has become the last bastion of climate change denialism. And how does this happen? So we did some research and hired a firm called Graphica, who's done excellent network analysis research. And we put a circle around the main known climate deniers. We used the Dismog blog's list of climate deniers, which is a very deep, well-researched starting point. We created an online group to monitor their discussions of climate deniers. And we found that this group of climate deniers, actually over time, we started this project last January. We found that this, just before a pandemic, and we found that this group of climate deniers became anti-maskers in March. And they became racists in June when their Black Lives Matter protests. And they became misogynists in August when Kamala Harris was nominated. There was one group who was being rewarded for this behavior with their clicks. And you can see here, we pictured Naomi Sedit, who is been called the anti-Greta, propped up by paid, fossil fuel paid groups like the Heartland Institute. And she was introduced to the States back in March last year and had a big little bump of attention, but it rapidly faded. And what happened was she started embracing QAnon's more conspiratorial language, and she got very quickly a bump in her popularity. So causality is hard to prove, but what you can say is that overall, the trend towards disinformation actually is rewarding people. There's an incentive for this behavior. And that incentivization is why it's structurally gamed against the issues that we care about. Next slide, please. What we did in tracking misinformation was, is that we found that climate change denialism since the beginning of the administration has been on the rise. It's more episodic now. It's not just the Pat Michaels or Michael Schellenbergers or Bjorn Lomborgs of the world who are constantly doing these pieces, though they get prominence they shouldn't. But that there are these giant episodic moments in addition where QAnon and right-wing echo chamber networks are jumping on the climate change issue and, of course, spreading climate misinformation. Next slide, please. So we decided to do a study. Some of you may remember in February last year, Texas experienced a terrible power outage from an extreme storm, which most scientists would say is linked to climate change, the rise in extreme storms. What happened through that episode over the course of just 4 days on social media was really alternate reality perversion of what actually happened to who was held responsible. On social media, at the end of 4 days, the narrative came out that it was windmills was what had caused the whole problem. So we look, next slide. We looked day by day at how that happened. And we did a mapping of that network. And what you see is that on day one, a single post goes up of this picture of a windmill that's being sprayed by a helicopter. It's put up by a person named Oilfield Rando, which tells you a little bit about who they are, and to make a mockery of why clean energy, renewable power has been contributing to this crisis. You know, we'll start from the beginning to say that that image is from 2018 and from Sweden. It was an entirely false image. It wasn't from Texas, but that didn't stop what happened, what came next. What came next is that over the next day, that was taken up by much larger social media accounts. The day after that, it was taken up by mainstream news outlets, right-wing news outlets rather, not mainstream, and Tucker Carlson spreading it. And within days, it had millions and millions of views. The very next thing, which is the thing that's actually affects our ability to make change, is that it came out as a talking point from Texas Governor Abbott's lips, where they were blaming the unreliability of renewable energy as being the cause of the problem, instead of what we know, which was that the fossil fuel infrastructure failed, the lack of attention to the grid failed, the carbon in the atmosphere failed. But it was a brilliant move on their behalf to redirect the problem to the exact opposite direction. And the thing was that in the mainstream media in Texas, the mainstream media did a great job of debunking this myth and not repeating it. And that's in Texas, which is not the most progressive state. So the only place where this lie was allowed to go viral was on social media through the platforms that we have been talking to say, you should watch for these people, watch for these conversations. And on those very platforms, from Twitter to Facebook, is where it went completely viral and turned into a permanent talking point now that the worst of the Jim Jordans in the US Congress, the worst of them are now using the unreliability of green energy as a major talking point. So next slide. I'd say, from a big picture, how do we solve this? And we are not going to solve this by whack-a-moling our way into the problem. That is the individualist solution, that the poor kid here who's been lured in by the carnival barker of social media is then having to take responsibility for knocking down every one of these giant people. The game is fixed, and we shouldn't have to be taking it upon ourselves as individuals. This is a problem of their creation, a solution they need to own. Next slide, please. So our strategic approach of our coalition, of which Union of Concerned Scientists and Friends of the Earth, along with Environmental Defense Fund and about 25 other US environmental groups, have created a climate change disinformation coalition. We've focused on accountability for all the major tech platforms that are spreading climate change disinformation, and urge them to create community standards the way that they are with coronavirus, where climate change denialism is not allowed to be spread. We've urged them to take things like two strikes approach for known deniers, people like Tucker Carlson or Bjorn Lomborg, who consistently are paid to lie about climate change, that those people should have the virality functions removed from their posts. Two strikes for known deniers is a pretty simple accountability strategy. Virality is a gift, and we should take it away from them. And then last, next slide, there is a thing, sometimes it doesn't seem so functional, called the US Congress. So we would love to invoke them and the administration to do their job in having big picture regulation that starts actually with, again, back to Lindsay's power analysis of the problem, but it starts with breaking up big tech, and it starts with the antitrust movements that are now growing under the administration to stop them having such unfettered power. It's an end to surveillance advertising. It's requiring transparency of the data. One of the biggest campaigns that is happening throughout the progressive movement is to disclose the data so that we can actually see what's going on. This report that we did relatively with blinders on, because there's a baseline of data that Facebook not only doesn't make available, but increasingly makes it much harder to see and interpret for researchers. So requiring the data, breaking up big tech, ending surveillance as a practice. And then lastly, we think that the administration should have a national disinformation coordinator so that each individual agency has a unified sense on how it could fight this problem. And for my last slide, that's a segue to it, next slide, is that we are intentionally intersectional. We, from the outset, have partnered with the civil rights movement, who has for years been talking to Facebook about how to reduce hate online. We've partnered with women's rights groups about sexual harassment online, and tech-focused nonprofits who are focusing more on antitrust and surveillance. All these things have a commonality, which is the unregulated, unchecked corporate power. And all of this to fire you up and also maybe to make you feel a little bit depressed by this. I think that the one hopeful thing I could hope to leave you with is that what is interesting about the way Facebook presents itself in all of our lives, in all of our campaigns' lives, is that we have to be intersectional in order to fight them. Because the way they are destroying each of our individual communities is so similar that we can only come together in order to fight back. And so that is my hope in over the coming years, that while they seem to be just pulling us all apart at the seams, that will be the one saving grace, because the only way we will fight back is by holding hands all together to hold them accountable. Thanks so much. And I'll move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Michael, for this eye-opening presentation. Also, we're learning a lot, not only about the disinformation, but what we can do and should be involved with. Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from our friend Bhanu, bringing some of more international view to our discussions. Bhanu, please.
Thank you so much, Astrid. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Very good. I appreciate that you have invited UNESCO to be part of this panel, as climate change disinformation is a priority issue that we deal with. One of the things that I must note here is we convene today in a very exceptional times. We now live in a new normal. The COVID-19 pandemic has transformed the way how we lived, worked, and interacted with one another. And although it may be difficult to tear our minds away from the ongoing global health crisis that the virus has brought to the livelihoods globally, today I would like to recognize the global environmental crisis and the disinformation thereof caused by climate change, which we have been dealing with for some time now, and which deserves our urgent action. There is no universally accepted way to define false information. This is something that Astrid, Lindsay very rightly noted. However, there is no doubt that such false information can downplay the severity of the phenomenon and may even prevent the dissemination of accurate information into into the sphere of information. It is not pandemic alone that has wreaked havoc. Many other extraordinary and destructive events have occurred since the beginning of the last year. Let me note a few recent ones. 3 months ago in June and July, Northwestern America from Oregon and the state of Mexico in the US and British Columbia to Saskatchewan in Canada was caught under a strange heat dome that peaked the temperature above 121 degrees Fahrenheit. It killed almost 1,200 people in Canada and in the US. In mid-July, South Asia and Western Europe were hit by devastating floods after torrential rain, which was very high intensity, low duration rainfall that killed a lot of people in Germany, as well as in Belgium, as well as and also in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. Last month, flood hit China and claimed about 33 lives. Shocking statistics have emerged that the downpour dumped a year's worth of rain in just 3 days in this city. California right now is already battling with wildfires. But let's take a slightly longer time frame and provide a different view on this thing. A recent report published by WMO provides a very interesting statistics. The weather and climate related phenomena has killed almost 115 people and caused about $202 million in losses on a daily basis for the past 50 years. On a daily basis, I note that again. The number of climate-linked disasters have increased by a factor of 5 over the past 50 years. This is primarily driven by climate change and extreme weather. The figures are alarming indeed. Between 1970 and 2019, with the statistics reports, 11,000 reported climate-linked disaster occurred, which killed 2 million people and resulted in a whopping $3.64 trillion in damages. What is striking to note that although while these disasters are globally distributed, more than 91% of deaths occurred in developing countries. So this primarily shows that even if the climate change will wreak its havoc, primarily the people in the developing countries are going to feel the burns of it. These facts are a warning for many, and the environmental movements has gained traction and media attention. It is, however, difficult to gauge if these disaster or COVID-19 outbreaks trend as the hottest media topic in the world. Although the outgoing health crisis appears to have diverted world's attention away from climate change, the threat remains serious and warrants continuous effort to find ways to fight these menaces side by side. Approaching COP26 has already increased the world's attention for climate change, yet climate change disinformation isn't a theme recognized by IPCC as the major foci for its debate in the upcoming COP26, something that we want to fill from our sources and means. Colleagues, our fight against COVID-19 has taught us several important lessons about the key roles of accurate information in informing effective policy responses and encouraging public to take the right decision. As has been well documented, the COVID-19 pandemic has been accompanied by infodemic, a word that WHO chief coined a few months ago. Essentially, an excessive amount of information, including misinformation, which is inaccurate information that is believed to be true and shared with the intent of being helpful. On the flip side, there is a disinfodemic or disinformation, which is false information that is knowingly produced and disseminated or propagated, targeting various interest groups or citizens at large. Additionally, false information has fostered several doubts about the origin of the virus. If we link disinformation with the pandemic, and its social and economic effects, of course, are also a question several times. Driving, there is a deep politicization of this discussion, and also polarization has become, and also there is a lot of finger pointing that is happening at this moment. This is exactly true for climate change as well. Access to quality information, therefore, has gained a renewed attention in the public eyes, and its significance has become clear to all. It is access to accurate information, not disinformation, that makes the right to freedom of expression meaningful and helpful to the societies. Verifiable and reliable information, such as that produced based on scientific facts and professional journalism, are key issues in designing and informing effective public health responses. It is also important for building a common foundation of knowledge for the public, who only then can take appropriate measures to protect themselves and others. Disinformation, therefore, predates COVID-19, and it is obstructing effects will be familiar to actors in the environmental field. In the context of climate change, disinformation is commonly used to deny urgency to appreciate and act by emphasizing the uncertainty of the trend of global warming or its attribution to human beings, claiming that impacts are not serious or warning that the negative impacts of mitigation policies. Even in the recent environmental disaster, false information was rampant. During last year's Australian bushfire, for example, there were claims that most of the fires were caused by arsonists and not by climate change. During recent typhoon in the Bay of Bengal, false claims encouraged people to engage in dangerous action, such as opening their windows. And during recent hurricane in US, videos of previous disastrous episodes were wrongly distributed. Accurate information can therefore explain the science of climate change, describe what can be done to adapt to the impact, and what can be done to respond to these threats. This can in turn create synergy amongst member states and governments, save life, inform plans, change policy, empower people to make informed choices, and so forth. Here, I would like to invite all of you to join, UNESCO in its campaign to and create a multi-stakeholder platform against climate change disinformation. Under the World Summit on Information Society processes, UNESCO is charged with Action Line C3 to ensure universal access to scientific information as knowledge. In recognition of the importance of the issues of climate change and disinformation, the intersection between them, UNESCO has initiated several projects. Just to name a few: journalism handbooks educate media personnel on reporting climate change. Another publication titled Journalism, Fake News and Disinformation, which is a handbook for journalism education and training, provides training for fighting back against disinformation and misinformation. MailClicks is another initiative that we have, which uses social media to raise awareness about media literacy and debunk disinformation, including about climate change. And UNESCO co-chairs Broadband Commission right now, working on freedom of expression and addressing disinformation. Much recently, UNESCO, in partnership with IPS Academy, organized a 4-part webinar in June 2020. Which was organized in a multi-stakeholder manner. The series brought together experts from around the world and produced a set of recommendations. This event segued into another discussion that took place during Internet Governance Forum in November, and a series of activities were launched later. A few involving young people have been planned, which will be implemented during COP26, and I'm sure my colleague Ricardo Gracie, who will speak after me, will share these details with you. So what can we do then? I would then like to urge all of you to take note that effects of climate change is happening now. It is happening for the farmers in northern India, on plains of Nepal, who are struggling to cope with unseasonal floods and torrential rain. It is happening for the villagers of Newtok, Alaska, whose towns are slowly sinking. It is happening for the residents of California, who have had their houses decimated due to wildfire. As one global community, I believe that we have enough resources and intelligence to deal with climate change disinformation today. To this end, we have to address both the sources from where the information originates and the recipients of false information. On one hand, we must ensure that the sources of climate information are free of bias and falsehood, and promote the production of dissemination of true information from reliable sources. This we must ensure through transparency norms, regulation, and technological solution. On the other, we have to work with the recipient of information and enhance their capacity to isolate truth from fiction and provide them with fact-checking services. There is a need to identify a solution that can be comprehensively tackle both sides of disinformation. We know that this requires a collaborative approach that would bring together various stakeholders such as scientists, journalists, citizens, and synergize their efforts to fight disinformation. It must also be it is also very important to incorporate the power of new technologies, so that artificial intelligence and, of course, common sense. But just to give you a few take-home messages, let me just note that availability of information and exposure to an information are two radically different concepts. There is availability of information and there is exposure to information. So I think there is a need for us to decipher that. There is no media and news channel that are opaque, for possible political pressure and direction. And this is globally, and I make that point. There are no media outlets that are free of some level of bias. So even if our true information is fed to a media channel, that gets somehow twisted to serve certain interest group or people. Polishing and editing happens, and a use of comma here or a full stop there can drastically change the message that gets relayed. Therefore, even if a piece of information is correct, end users can easily be fed with wrong message. One of the latest fad is the use of algorithm to somehow influence search engine optimization. You can easily be blocked from useful news sources. So even a piece of information is available, it cannot be it can be easily hidden, from your eyes. So this is happening in different parts of the world where resource sharing takes place, between two neighboring countries, and one country essentially denies take another country, benefit or using, that resources fairly. And this is also done to somehow construct a new dam or something like that, so that the other country cannot oppose. Another thing is money can buy your way out. That your previous president won the election, and there was media was I think very nicely supplied with resources. And algorithmic ranking can easily be changed. And if you may be doing a Google search right now and just trying to find out what has happened to climate change disinformation, 50% of the users only click the first result on algorithmic search on Google. Only 0.7% of end users click on the seventh. So if you do not, go up to the seventh page in your, Google search, you will definitely not be able to come up with the kind of search or kind of information that you're trying to find. And unless there is enough local content added to the search engine optimization does not go up. So one of the messages for you will be to use or produce as much local content as possible so that people can use it for their benefit. And alternative local content are mostly paid off stuff, so that I would essentially do not like to talk about. So thank you so much. You've been a very, very, very nice audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhanu, for that perspective. I'm getting lots of questions about presentations, about if we'll be able to share presentations, about if Bhanu will be able to maybe post in the chat a lot of the reports that you mentioned, Bhanu, and a lot of the initiatives. Whatever you can post on the chat for our audience, it will be helpful. Otherwise, we can follow up later on. And as I said, last but not least, we have Ricardo Gracie that will close our panel, and then we'll move on to Q&As. Ricardo, please.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you to each one of the panelists. Thank to the audience for following us and raising questions that are so important. So I think that in the previous interventions, the problem has been very well presented, and also the international perspective that opened Bhanu's intervention, that I particularly thank also for in a part leading to my own intervention. When Bhanu mentioned UNESCO's partnership with IPS Academy, it's the owner of the independent initiative that we have called Citizens Platform on Climate Change and a Sustainable World. So I would be putting the accent, because that's the sense of our initiative and others linked to it, on solutions and the impact of information also in what now we call the Global South. most of what Lindsay and Michael have been focusing earlier has an evident impact in the global south, because things jump and because, I mean, mainstream media websites and all the social media have an enormous dissemination worldwide, and then local media pick them up, while the social media has a particular impact on youth. So the difficulties that from a worldwide perspective that we are facing, and the challenges that we are facing, and are enormous. When we decided to give this step of creating a citizens platform, it was because of disinformation and fake news, where this was 2 years ago, evidently generating confusion, impotence, frustration, inactivism, with different kind of arguments, by denying the science information, but also with other kind of messages, like saying it's too late to do anything, or even then that renewable energy is inefficient, and so on and so on and so on. It's been very interesting for me I mean, the detailed information that Lindsay and Michael has shared with us, because it gives the dimension of the problem and goes directly to the fact that, well, in the USA, according to a Lancet's research and evaluation of the impact of each country on the problems we are living, is leading it with a 40%. And in altogether, the global north is 90% of the impact on the climate that we are trying to resolve. This indeed is linked to a power issue, evidently, and that's why it is so complicated to the challenge we are facing. However, we thought, we are a group of journalists, communicators, graphic designers, artists, some of us with many, many years of experience in reporting and communicating, and in dealing with media resources and managing media resources and organizing media resources. So what also came together to us, together with the evidence of the disinformation, is the lack of information, or to say it better, the lack of enough impact of all the information that many, many hundreds and thousands are producing on a daily basis. So for us, this has to do with contributing to the solutions that we are seeking. And that comes directly in our relation with UNESCO, when together, after the launching of this climate platform last year, we conducted to the point of saying, okay, we must come together. All these thousands of organizations of different size, working, producing things every day, should converge. So we talk of the climate change communication convergence. Let's say there must be ways in which the information that we have, the accurate one, together with work with scientist organizations, but then all the expertise that many of us throughout the years have accumulated in social action, come together and find the ways to create points of reference for other dissemination of information. This is the opposite of competing. Exactly, it's coming together to share contents and to disseminate those contents and to promote the existence of such a point of reference in all the means that we do have. And with this, I'm trying to say that while from a strictly financial resources point of view, it's hard to match the 15.6 million that ExxonMobil paid to Facebook along 2 years' time, but we have our own strengths, let's say. The strength is the passion, because this is not collateral, the conviction that nevertheless, and whatever this information is submerging us, the communication of the climate change issue is probably one of the more successful communication campaigns ever. Today, I would say that the problem is no longer an opinion, but a fact. And from our perspective, what happens is, nevertheless, the confusion and the difficulty to know what to do and how to do it. Part of the disinformation includes what a science communicator in the UK calls destructive information. It's not in the disinformation, misinformation, fake news, which is the message that says, okay, you do these little things and you will be contributing enormously to the solution of the problem. And so this calms you individually, because then you use the plastic or you don't use it, etc., which is nevertheless important, but obviously is shifting from a systematic problem to remaining in the same system, doing individual actions that may change everything. Bottom line, if the name of our initiatives ends with a sustainable world, is because we have no doubt that there will be no solution to the climate change threatened if we don't produce, consume, and live together in a different way. So this is, Michael highlighted that the disinformation grows and is growing and growing, because indeed, this is a clash of paradigms. And that's the bottom line of the game. We are in these days promoting this climate change communication convergence together with UNESCO. We have come together into specific action on that, combined with giving Global South youth a further leadership role, using as the opportunity the COP26. So we have organized, and we're starting today, a number of webinars with knowledgeable youth in Latin America, Africa, Asia, the small island states, and the Caribbean, of course. And it's extremely interesting in the conversation with this youth that are not teenagers, let's say, are researchers, graduates, nevertheless activists and concerns, but we build this conversation among them, and in an immediate next step in a debate with governmental representatives on the basis of highlighting existing solutions, existing practices that are already implementing those solutions and the outcomes, and to question an agenda that is led by decision makers and put things 2050, 2030 if we are faster, and while there are enough resources to challenge the interests that are making it impossible to implement them. Indeed, the power issue in the Global South operates in a different way, as you have illustrated in the United States, which is normal. For instance, in the webinar tonight with the Latin Americans and Spanish-speaking Caribbeans, well, one person will analyze lithium. Lithium is something we don't see in the news. There are many things we don't see in the news, and lithium is essential for the electric cars. So I live in Europe. Electric cars are being promoted more and more and more, and nobody knows about what happens with the lithium and what happens with the country that have lithium. Last year, and so that is part of the lack of information. I mean, there are things that are not disseminated. So what are we trying to do? We try to produce contents. We have deliberately shaped an editorial policy that tends to show solutions, because there are already a lot pointing on the problems and on the non-solutions, and makes no sense to overlap or to continue adding more of the same. Instead, when we launch this as an information and communication initiative, not collateral to any other activity, and then undertaking in a very professional way, we decided that we have mainly two things to do: to produce very accurate information working with scientists, of course, but at the same time to cover worldwide what thousands and thousands of individuals, I mean citizens, are producing, what we call the best practices. And we try to cover that in a way that could even explain to anyone not only the result of the activity in itself, but how it was started, what were the problems and difficulties faced, and how this was overcome in a way that represents an initiative, let's say, the possibility of moving into action. Another thing that comes out in the, and this meets one of the questions that I read on the question and answer section, to education. And in the conversations with this youth in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the need of environmental education in a systematic, regular way comes up constantly. Because the reality that they faced is that young people, which is many of us are focusing, well, are not aware of too many things. And so they are distracted by other things. The second element that I already mentioned before, but is being built in a concrete way, is this multi-stakeholder climate change communication convergence. Multi-stakeholder means not only media, but also any kind of serious and reliable and accurate organization that is producing contents. And that's some of the things that we all together can do, and with requiring a rather simple management, while each one conserves its own identity. And we are trying to add, yes, more sophisticated ways of marketing and promoting what we do, which includes creating a network of advertisement agencies that are, some of them, be in different parts of the world, interested in joining. This may not occur substantially, I mean, immediately in a substantial way, the disinformation, but the sense of our initiative is to favor constantly the possibility of action by citizens. And this, we think that through a proper, massive and well-positioned information and communication action should start showing results. I will interrupt my presentation here, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. So we have a lot of information to digest. we are trying to answer some of the questions in the Q&A directly on the Q&A. So if you're asking for links or PowerPoint presentations or something like that, I ask the panelists if they can offer that information in the Q&A box by typing an answer there. We're going to now, we're going to the Q&As that we haven't responded to yet. We are going to go in order of that they were asked, and we're going to alternate people so that the same person does not get 2, 3, 4 questions, and everybody has a chance to ask one. So I am going to start question number 1. Why in the USA is it so impossible to design, to fund by government, and to implement a high quality, demanding secular public education system all across the country? Please be frank as regards your answers. I think we're all being frank here, but you know, just making sure that the question is, and I think Lindsay and Michael can address that.
Yeah, this is the thought that comes to mind first for me based on my expertise. It is not the sole answer to this, or is it intended to be comprehensive? But in my my mind, I think about historically, I think about something that I've probably read this quote from Charles Koch 200 times over the course of the last 10 years, maybe more, from my work with Uncoke. It was from his 1974 speech that he gave to corporate leaders following the Powell Memo, that helps me understand why this is so hard for us, and I think kind of gets at this question. He says that there are basically 4 ways in which the pro-capitalist businessman can fight for free enterprise: through education, through the media, by legal challenges, and by political action. I do maintain, however, that the educational route is both the most vital and the most neglected. The educational method enables the businessman to work effectively without exposing himself to the same public criticism that other methods, particularly politics, seem to evoke. By education, I mean basic scholarly research and writing that will provide us with better understanding of the market system and better arguments in favor of this system. I believe that this long-term educational approach is absolutely necessary to restore the free enterprise system. So like that, this is a quote from one of the most wealthy, powerful people, not just in the country, but on the planet. And he has, is coordinating this massive network of other very wealthy, very powerful folks who have like-minded ideas. And this has been going on since the 70s. That is why this is so hard, right? Is because this network, this is what comes to mind for me, is this network with all of this money and these resources and their power, see the educational route as the most influential way to make sure that their ideas are advanced. And so you bet that those resources are being poured in to impact what happens in our education, right? And that's why we're seeing the advancement of charter schools and privatizing education to have more of that control and that corporatization of education. Why we're seeing, why we see someone like Betsy DeVos step in, under the Trump administration to be the director of education, who has been a longtime member of the Koch network. Why we're seeing, this research come out all across the country and universities to influence political, legislative decisions. And so this is why this is so hard. This is my answer on why I think this is so hard. But that's just, that's my way of thinking of it based on my expertise and my background. Michael, do you have additional thoughts?
Yeah, just a short one, because I know we want to get to the other questions, but also like the framing of this question is sometimes our challenge. Yes, textbooks are being attempted to be rewritten and false research is being published. But that is the way we're thinking about this in this question is an individualist frame. That's separate from the fact that there are corporations who are incentivizing the spread of disinformation, and that they've been told repeatedly that has harmful effects, from teen mental health to stopping climate change action. So yes, let's all get more educated. Let's be wary of these false papers, but there's a much more simple, direct line to limiting the disinformation. Move on to the next one.
Thank you. Next question is, are there any progressive large donor-funded think tanks to counter social change or to effect social change for that matter? Thank you.
Well, I can just give the short US context, which is we would love, as the Climate Change Disinformation Coalition and many other entities would love more donor interest in this. And I think the general argument to a climate change funder is that if we don't put money into stopping disinformation, all of our advocacy and research work is going to be compromised because it's the fundamental underpinning of how we talk about any of those things. There is an increasing amount of interest this year in that, and that's just US context. So Bhanu and Ricardo might have other things to say.
Okay. Anybody wants to add anything?
Yes, just a couple. There are a couple of donors who have come forward and they've pledged their support. I can think of CEDA, which is a Swedish development agency. They provide a lot of money, resources to counter disinformation on climate change, and in other social issues as well. So that is that may be a possible source to raise some funds for this. But if you go to any, say, UN agency which has a science communication or environmental like issue to deal with, they will also be able to provide certain, say, resources, as well as act work with you in a team to take the agenda forward in all possible sense of the word. Over to you.
Thank you, Bhanu. One question related to the United States. With the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, what's the plan to counter the right-wing money pouring into politics and legislation?
Yeah, I can take that. This is Lindsay. I think that the key thing that I would point us all to is the For the People Act, which in the House is HR 1 and the Senate is S1, that would stem the flow of dark money influence. I'm going to actually paste in something that you can all do to take action. This is a Union of Concerned Scientists action that can be taken regarding the filibuster. And so, yeah, so I mean, this is a crucial bill that we need to push through. But all of the folks that I named earlier are actively working to combat that. And so, this is legislation we need to be engaging on. We need to be supporting, and that link that I just sent is one way you can do so. I will also say that if you are a scientist and are interested in taking action on democracy-specific disinformation, I'm also about to paste in the chat more information on how to get involved on that front.
Thank you, Lindsay. We're trying to go through as many questions as we can, so I'm just going to move. If someone knowingly and deliberately publishes false information about a private individual, that individual, if he or she can show harm, can sue for libel? Sorry, my English. If a corporation publishes this information and the public can show harm, can the public sue the corporation to stop it or ask for damages?
I think I'll take a first stab at that. I think this is a great question because it brings us back to our normal world, our non-online world, where you just can't do these things to each other. We have conventions over time that are proven that somehow once we're in the realm of social media, we think don't exist. So a similar thing to what you're saying, John, is a newspaper, when they print a story, they fact check it. And if they get it wrong and they say somebody embezzled money and they didn't, they get sued. There's a process of fact checking that exists in the world. And I'm not sure why we think that doesn't have to happen in a transparent manner. And not only is there fact checking, there's correcting the record, which every journalist knows they've accidentally done something and they the next day have to print a retraction. And it's a bad thing for the journalists. They don't like to do it. But it's a process that keeps us all honest. So somehow, with all of our great technology and the brainiacs at Facebook and other social media platforms, we seem to throw up our hands like it's not possible to correct the record. So that's one campaign that a group called Avaz has launched with other groups to correct the record. When you see disinformation, when somebody is exposed to it, they can also be exposed to something that says that was an accident, you shouldn't, or this is the truth of that. And again, I just suggest thinking about our offline sense of humanity and normal systems of accountability and truth and bring those further online.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Our next question is, how has the percent of deniers in Congress changed over the past 20 years? Do we have an idea? Maybe we don't have an idea.
I mean, I would say, sorry to keep on answering, but climate denialism used to be something that was very subtle in Congress, and now it's open and it's much more virulent. So, the number of QAnon supported candidates who are now in Congress is far higher. At least before there was some reasonable conversation, but that's getting much worse, obviously, in the US Congress.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to bring this back up because it's important, even though I have mentioned a little bit here and there. I'm hoping you will address what we as individuals can do, including groups we can join that can use scientifically unskilled people. If we can do a quick roundup of groups or things that people can do, I think that will be super helpful.
I can kick it off again. So just to re-elevate the links that I shared earlier on taking action to call your senators about the filibuster and about Senate Bill 1 and the For the People Act. So that's one. Another thing, and I just want to elevate this point of, like, for non-scientifically skilled people, we all have something that we can do for sure. And one of the things that I hope that in my portion I got across is the power of understanding who these bad actors are and naming them, helping to expose them. There's real power in that, and helping our peers and the public better understand the deliberate deception that these folks who are funding and fueling disinformation have. And so I think that is something that we can all continue to do in our communication over social media. If you want to write op-eds or LTEs to draw more attention to certain bad actors that are in your state, they are everywhere. And to, outrage is a very powerful organizing tool, and information is very powerful. So that's one thing I would definitely want to elevate there.
I'm sure others have more to say. Anybody else? Maybe not. Okay, I will go to the next question. What should be the criteria to define relevant and accurate information? That's very interesting, because there are lots of studies that say that people should learn how to identify fake news and stuff like that. So if you have any tips on that, that would be great.
No, that's an interesting question, I think. No, I mean, of course, it's I would say that in our field, I mean, we are talking about climate change and disinformation and fake news and climate change. So accurate. There's an issue at the same time where the role of media contributes to the problem, because I mean, most of media is ruled by the principle of balancing the sources, and so this adds to a confusion, because then for a regular journalist, if you get as a source someone that is pointing out on specific things that contribute to enlarge the climate change problem, well, by according to the studies that the journalist had, then should then go to another source that would say the opposite. So this leaves us and that. I make this introduction because this is a point that we also always have to consider when we are handling information. So what does it mean, as you ask, it's accurate? I mean, for us, accurate has to do with sources that are undeniable. And in the case of climate change, are particularly the scientists. So in our editorial policy, our main sources are scientists. And then, of course, it happens that you have different kind of scientists. You have scientists that join the group of the deniers of the problem, but that is not difficult to be identified and to understand the origin of that attitude. So at the same time, it's not so difficult to understand what are the serious scientists organizations. So that defines accurate. Accurate is also completed by being extreme to the point of saying that something is doubtful, because you can and we should report on many things that eventually are maybe being tested. So we have the duty to include that, to be sure that an information is accurate to the extreme of telling you, well, okay, this still needs to be demonstrated, or this is 80% sure, but there's a 20% that is still being studied or researched. This may lead to say, well, what happens with objectivity? No, personally, and with me, many, we put between brackets the objectivity mantra, and we highlight the be honest mantra. Being honest means that you clearly position yourself, as each one of the panelists today have done. You are positioned in a certain place. The one to whom you are addressing your message has the right to know exactly where you are, and that's by far more important than the established paradigm of being balanced. So one source and the opposite source, or being objective, which doesn't exist because it's impossible. I mean, none of us is objective because each one of us is positioned socially and politically and in a certain place. I hope I may have answered or raised new questions.
No, you did a great job. Lots of interesting stuff there. Anybody else has anything to add?
Astrid, if I might add real quick, just in response, like from this question and the one before, just something to look forward to, is that we desperately need to help train all of you, on how to prevent misinformation and when to address it. Because we don't want to be part of the problem, which sometimes we can do by doing like direct response to just any bit of misinformation. And so I just want to make sure that y'all know that I see and hear that. And my hope is that with my friends at UCS, that we can play a role in helping to provide some of that training and support so we can all learn to do that better. And I just want to acknowledge that we weren't able to get into that level of like how to in the session, but it's going to be crucial. So in the meantime, if you see opportunities to be trained on how to, address misinformation and disinformation and when, because we shouldn't always do it, definitely take those opportunities, but hopefully we'll be able to be in touch shortly and provide some ourselves.
Thanks.
Just
Next,
to
Bhanu.
support what, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Let's go to Bhanu and then Michael, and then if you have anything else, Ricardo, we go back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Just that, we at UNESCO are thinking about, creating something, which is a bit, say, low key, and also technologically as a little more, advanced to primarily for climate change, and this will be essentially like, fact factcheck.com. So you put in an information and try to verify whether or not that piece of information that you have access is true or not, and then you'll provide. And we're looking for partners. And if you are interested and you run a company of that sort, please reach out to us. Number one. Number two is we think that technology has a lot of things to offer. And then now with machine learning and artificial intelligence application, a lot of things can be done. And if you think that you have got something that can help in addressing misinformation, we'll be more than happy to work with you. Number three is very simple. We need to add local content. Unless you add local content, the search optimization that would not come up. It would not provide the exact information that is relevant to your local area in the first page of Google. And if that's not appear on first page of Google, you are not going to click in any one of them. Mind you, there are big lobbyists and there are groups who are doing a number of things, and if they have got resources at their that they can spend, they can in fact make even a fake news trend like anything. Making trending a topic on social media is like a piece of cake now. So I think we have to somehow find a way to counterbalance it. Thank you so much.
And I just add, this really is a great question. Obviously, you're pulling a lot out of all of us, and it's not. I don't want to oversimplify it to say that it's like just a turnkey solution. But fact checking is obviously one thing, and again, it's got the structure of the history of what we know about news and journalism. There's fact checking, and lots of those things are happening. Initiatives that I think need to be vastly improved on the platforms, but the concept itself is there. And I think even beyond that, the concept that we all get to create community standards needs to be recognized from the outset. So the one fortunate thing about COVID over the last year is that we did create community standards on all the platforms that you can't spread disinformation about the value of masks, or that the vaccine is going to somehow make magnets stick to you, or whatever things. That is a community standard that society created and said, we're not going to allow this anymore. Just the same way that we said that advertising cigarettes to children was not allowed. These are community things. We are a community, global or local, and we can create these standards. So that's been done before. And I'd say the last thing is just, again, there's an 80-20 rule that happens to most of us in life. And in the field of disinformation, you saw that COVID disinformation, 12 people were providing some 2/3 of all the disinformation. That is not free speech. That is the abuse of technology by certain people, and that's tyranny of a minority. And we can't confuse that with society being allowed to agree on definitions and having mechanisms to enforce.
Very well said, Michael. Ricardo, did you have any last comment?
Just briefly, I wanted to underline further one of Bhanu's remarks at the end about the absolute relevance to accuracy of the context and the local context. I mean, this is a major and substantial issue that, at least in my experience, I verify constantly when moving around the world and comparing what I see with what mainstream media reports. And this is a gigantic problem, really, and we need to be aware of that, because this happens all the time. It's happening now with Afghanistan, for instance. It's not climate change, but you have the mainstream media that approach something from outside. And the same is with climate change issues, with local citizens' initiatives, answers, but it's always referred or happens in a context. Change happens locally and in a context.
Very well said. Thank you. Gracias, Ricardo. I'm going to go to the next question. We're trying to go through as many as possible. A lot of people state that climate isn't what we should be focused on, that other topics such as immigration, such as immigration, Afghanistan, abortion, etc., should be the focus. How can we get across that these topics, while important, are not more important than our climate? Some comments that I read also focus on the price tag of combating climate change. How can we convince people that it is worth the money?
Yeah, say something, yeah? Because I mean, I understand the question, whether it is a real concern or is pushing us to say something, no? Unfortunately, the production and dissemination of information operates in a way that something comes up in a moment and then disappears. Many times, you don't even know what happened afterwards. So I think that it's not a matter of classifying what is more important, less important, because that's following really the main media criteria that has a list of what is important, what is not important, to the extreme. I mean, I just briefly tell you a case that happened and was researched, that happened many, many years back, when two main international news agencies at the time, which was Associated Press and United Press International, the main market was the United States, so they were competing to win with the United States market. Well, for that market, they arrived to the conclusion that information on South Africa, the country South Africa, was not really of a great public interest. So during 10 years, they produced no news on South Africa. I refer this because this continues happening all the time. So of course that Afghanistan is important. Within the COVID issue that we are going through, it's also equally important the enormous amount of people that did not have access to clinics and hospitals and died because of cancers that couldn't be treated or heart diseases, let's say. And all of this is important. Now, the climate change issue, which is linked to the sustainable development reflection, is today the mother of most of the things we are going through. That includes immigration. Immigration is a big issue, covered when it matters to a country that seems to be affected by that, but it will increase because there will be, as they are already today, climate change migrants. I mean, nevertheless, together with the disinformation in the majority of the countries of the world, climate change is covered randomly and not systematically. Now we will see more information because COP26 is arriving. So information is a market issue, and so you have to satisfy an audience that then will be using your thing.
Anybody else has any comments on that, or shall we keep moving? Keep moving. Okay. Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future imagines a replacement social media platform that is public, not-for-profit, transparent, privacy protecting. Given the political difficulties in the US of regulating these giant companies, what practical steps would it take to replace them with more pro-social platforms? I think the last part is the most important part. Yeah.
I'll start to something I said earlier, which is that the antitrust is critical to this, that we look at the platform's overall political power, and you look at the history of how antitrust has worked in the US, where there have been giant monopolies, whether it was the aluminum industry in the 1940s after the war, or the telecom industry in the 80s. It was broken up because it served the public to have more diversity. So that I think is absolutely a key. And the other thing that's beautiful in what you're saying is like thinking what you're describing there, a platform that's public, not profit, transparent, and privacy protecting. All these things existed in the early days of the internet before the platforms were concentrated. I mean, even just look at your individual experience in getting internet service. Most people in America have one or two choices. When it all started, those of us who are older remember there were like 10 different choices of places that you can get it. That concentration is I'd say the key to not being able to do that, because you can't offer alternatives.
Thank you. This one is about the youth movement on climate action in the US. If we could think to the future, how this movement will affect the outcome of legislation, do you think it will result in a strong pull for strong action, or would it lead to a stall in Congress on climate action? I always like youth questions.
As someone who, let's see, a dozen years ago, got my, more than that, just 15 years ago, whenever I was in college, got my start. It was, a huge part of my identity was priding myself as being a part of the youth climate movement. And that helped shape my career and led me to where I am. And most of the work that I have done has actually been in collaboration with and in support of youth-based climate organizers. And I can say that from what I've seen in my eyes, that tremendous shifts have happened as a result of the youth climate movements that have been forming and growing and expanding and being louder and more bold. I've seen that in the way that legislators have taken action or the messaging that is used. I've seen that in media coverage. I've seen that at organizations like UCS, where we are being pushed to take bolder action because of what our allied organizations who are youth-based leaders are calling on us to do. And that is not just UCS. So yes, we have a long way to go. We are running out of time on climate. And frankly, we need to keep listening to and, following the lead of these young people who have everything to lose without taking action and have so much fight in them. So I see so much change. There's so much more work to be done, and we need to be working with young people. And young people need to keep taking care of themselves to keep that fire alive, because we got a long fight ahead of us. Thanks for those of you who are on.
Woohoo! Well, speaking of running out of time, we are coming up at 5 minutes to the end of our event. And there is one question here that has a general, more global, aspect. So I'm going to go with that one. What specifically is your overall strategy for the upcoming United Nations key meetings events on climate? Is there a package of info available? If so, where? What are your plans for the upcoming climate meetings? I think that's for everybody. If anybody wants to answer.
Can I take that? Can I take that question? Yeah. As I had noted in my brief intervention, COP26, there are no specific session assigned particularly for climate change disinformation. But what we are doing, that is Ricardo's group and UNESCO, we are organizing a series of youth-led initiative or discussion on climate change disinformation. And our idea is to run this event in 5 different geographical setting around the world. And the outcome of that will be pitched to COP26. And this is where the young kids or young people will not question the politician what can be done, but they will present responses or solution on how disinformation can be upset. So this is something that we have done and we are doing. And there's also another event that we will be doing on Smart Campus Cloud Network, and the information to this effect is available on COP26 in a website. What I will do is, and if you need more information, you can contact us, and we'll be more than happy to provide you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to pitch in on that one? We're coming out at the closing, so. Okay. Okay, I think right now I'm going to go around if anybody has last closing remarks. There is one question that I think is interesting. Lindsay, you mentioned that we shouldn't always engage. We shouldn't always do it. I think that's an interesting one because a lot of people mistakenly try to engage with everything they see. And if one of you, Michael, anybody can address that before in the last couple minutes.
I mean, Michael, I think that your example of the case study you gave in Texas is such a great one, right? Of that, maybe you can kind of speak to that question with that example in mind.
Yeah, sorry, I was getting caught up in other questions I was trying to answer in the chat there about international regulation. Which one? Whose question are we referring to here?
When not to, like, that there is it was interesting that there are some times where we shouldn't respond to misinformation. So could you just speak to that maybe with that example?
Yeah, and I think this speaks to, Lindsay, what you're saying about getting trained up. It is, you can make it worse by responding because you add to the clicks and likes of that conversation. That's sort of like the same point that someone was making about George Lakoff and like, do we fight on the other people's terms? That's one part. The other part is that for women and women scientists in particular, they get really attacked online when they come out and fight disinformation. So that is not something that we want to put on individual people. So how to fight it and doing it as a coordinated effort or doing it through changing the policies that allow it, just sort of my preferred solution is something that you really need to be trained up for. This is, again, think of the single-use plastic bottle that you're going to save the world by recycling it. The issue is that you shouldn't have a single-use plastic bottle, and that's not your fault that you can't go into the grocery store anymore and get a glass bottle, which we used to have a whole system, and it got deconstructed by all these people.
Very well said. Well, we have 1 minute from the end. I'd like to thank all the panelists. Our super Allison Tennant, who is in the background making this all work. I'd like to thank her, and she tells us that she will save the chat and the Q&As to send out with the recording, so everybody will have access to that. We at the panel will try to answer questions that are still unanswered. We have many of them. This has been a great panel. Everybody has great questions, but unfortunately, we have limited time. So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate all the attendees, and thanks to the panel for great remarks and for a great session. And we'll follow up with the recording and maybe more information about how you can engage and what's next steps so that the session results in really actionable stuff. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Bye.
to you. Thanks to you, Astrid, for moderating so well.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful to work with you all. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Lindsay, Michael, Bhanu.